December 16, 1944, 0630 hours Mona, Germany. Inside his frozen command post, Hauptmann Klaus Rieche of the 12th SS Panzer Division scribbled into his logbook with shaking hands. What he recorded that morning would later stand out as one of the most chilling entries in the Wehrmacht's combat history. He wrote, "The Americans have unleashed a weapon that overturns every rule of battlefield tactics. Our soldiers are being massacred in their foxholes by artillery that explodes in the air, not on the ground. There is no shelter, no cover. Death comes from the sky itself." Through the mist, Rieche had just seen an entire German battalion destroyed while attempting to cross open ground near Hüningen. But it wasn't direct hits. Those were always rare in artillery battles, nor was it from ordinary timed shells which demanded exact calculations. Instead, it was something completely new. Shells that somehow knew when to explode, detonating about 30 feet above the ground, sending deadly shrapnel raining straight down. In only 3 minutes, 702 German troops were killed. A handful who staggered back alive were so shocked that they kept repeating the same words, "Die Luft tötet." The air kills. What Klaus Rieche had witnessed was the very first use of America's most secret battlefield weapon, the proximity fuse. This device, no larger than a coffee can, was nothing less than a miniature radar system built into an artillery shell. It was the world's first smart munition, a shell that could think for itself. Its impact was staggering. It boosted artillery effectiveness by more than 1,000%, saved tens of thousands of Allied lives, and transformed modern warfare. The statistics told the story clearly. Conventional anti-aircraft shells needed 500 rounds to bring down a single enemy plane. With proximity fuses, that number dropped to just 155. Against ground forces, normal artillery shells could kill entrenched troops only about 5% of the time. Proximity fuses pushed that figure up to 70%. And when German V-1 flying bombs threatened to wipe out London, proximity-fused guns destroyed 79% of the missiles within only 4 weeks. Yet this incredible weapon didn't begin in an American lab. Its origins stretched back to Britain during the bleakest months of 1939, October 30th, 1939. Exeter, England. As the first winter of war closed in, a young scientist named William Butement submitted a proposal that sounded like science fiction. An artillery shell that could automatically sense its target and detonate at the perfect moment. Butement, working at the Air Defense Establishment alongside colleagues Edward Shire and Amherst Thompson, based his idea on brutal wartime math. In the First World War, anti-aircraft gunners had fired an average of 8,500 rounds for every plane shot down. By 1939, with aircraft flying faster and higher, those odds had gotten even worse. Britain's survival against the Luftwaffe would depend on dramatically improving those chances. Butement's answer was simple in concept, but nearly impossible in practice. Use radio waves inside a shell to detect approaching planes and set off the fuse at exactly the right distance. The technical barriers, however, were overwhelming. The electronic fuse would have to survive being fired from a gun with forces 20,000 times stronger than gravity. Spin at 30,000 revolutions per minute, work in temperatures ranging from 50 degrees to 100 degrees, and still detect an aircraft 70 feet away. By June 1940, British scientists had working prototypes. They fired them in small rockets called unrotated projectiles against balloon targets. The tests showed that the idea could work, but the challenge was enormous. The vacuum tubes and circuits simply couldn't survive being fired from an artillery barrel. Britain didn't have the industrial resources to solve it alone. The breakthrough would come from across the Atlantic, thanks to one of the most important scientific missions of the war. September 6, 1940, Halifax, Nova Scotia. The Canadian Pacific liner Duchess of Richmond docked carrying cargo more valuable than gold. On board was Sir Henry Tizard, along with a locked black metal box that held Britain's most vital military secrets. This was the Tizard mission, an extraordinary gamble in which a nation fighting for its very existence handed over its most guarded technologies to a country not yet at war. By September 12th, the British delegation was in Washington, staying at the Wardman Park Hotel. Over the next week, they revealed everything: radar blueprints, jet engine designs, advanced explosives, and even chemical weapons research. But on September 19th, in a quiet conference room overlooking Connecticut Avenue, came the most important meeting of all. British physicist Dr. John Cockcroft explained the proximity fuse project to a young American scientist named Dr. Merle A. Tuve. Tuve, then 39, had grown up in rural South Dakota, building radios with his childhood friend Ernest Lawrence, who would later win the Nobel Prize. Just a month earlier, Tuve had been chosen by Vannevar Bush to lead Section T of the new National Defense Research Committee, a group created solely to develop proximity fuses. For Tuve, the assignment was personal. In August 1940, listening to news reports of the London Blitz with his wife Winnie, he heard about children being pulled from rubble and entire neighborhoods wiped out in minutes. He had turned to her and said, "We have to find a way to stop those bombers. Technology has to be the answer." Now Cockcroft was handing him exactly that chance. The British had proven the theory, but they admitted their limits. They lacked the factories, manpower, and resources to bring it to life. America's vast industrial base was the only hope. Tuve left that meeting knowing what lay ahead. The project would demand materials and techniques that didn't yet exist, and a scale of production unlike anything seen before. By December 1940, Tuve had converted the Carnegie Institution's Department of Terrestrial Magnetism in Washington, D.C., into the command center for America's most secret weapons project. Inside the old mansion at 5241 Broad Branch Road, he gathered a team of brilliant scientists. Richard B. Roberts, who had studied under Niels Bohr, Henry H. Porter, an acoustics expert, Robert B. Broad, who specialized in cosmic rays, and Lawrence Hofstad, a nuclear physicist. Together they would take on a challenge that seemed impossible and create the weapon that would help win the war. Lloyd Berkner, a leading figure in ionospheric research, and a 26-year-old physicist named James Van Allen, later world famous for discovering Earth's radiation belts, found themselves working on a wartime challenge that pushed electronics to their limits. Their task was to help create the proximity fuse, a device unlike anything that had ever existed. This new weapon had to function as a complete radar system inside a shell no bigger than a coffee can. It had to include a transmitter, a receiver, an amplifier, and a detonator, all in one unit. Not only did it need to send out radio waves and read their echoes, it also had to process the signal and trigger detonation, all while surviving forces that would normally destroy delicate electronics. Van Allen took on the hardest job, designing vacuum tubes that wouldn't shatter when fired from a gun. Standard tubes with thin glass and fragile filaments failed at forces as low as 100 times gravity. The fuse, however, needed to endure accelerations 200 times greater. For 6 months, Van Allen worked with the Massachusetts-based hearing aid manufacturer Raytheon. Together they developed miniature vacuum tubes using new construction methods adapted from hearing aid technology. The breakthrough came in January 1942 when Van Allen introduced what became known as the mousetrap spring design, a mechanical system that cushioned and protected the fragile tube filaments during the massive shock of firing, then released them to function normally once in flight. That invention was so important that its patent stayed classified until 1947. At the same time, Lloyd Berkner delivered his own critical advance in December 1940. He created a circuit that used separate transmitter and receiver functions, improving on the British autodyne concept. His design made the fuse more sensitive, reliable, and effective in combat. By March 1942, the project had outgrown the Carnegie Institution's facilities. Johns Hopkins University stepped in and established the Applied Physics Laboratory, APL, in a converted Chevrolet dealership at 8621 Georgia Avenue in Silver Spring, Maryland. The building still smelled of oil and rubber when the first scientists arrived, but within weeks it had been transformed into the most advanced electronics lab in the world. Merle Tuve became APL's first director. He created a work culture built around urgency and responsibility. Signs on the walls reflected this. One read, "I don't want any damn fool in this laboratory to save money. I only want him to save time." Another reminded the team, "Our moral responsibility goes all the way to the final battle use of this unit. Its failure there is our failure." The specifications of what they achieved remain astonishing even today. The proximity fuse functioned as a continuous wave radar system, operating between 180 and 220 megahertz, an advanced frequency range for the early 1940s. The projectile's metal casing acted as the transmitting antenna, powered by a small conical antenna in the nose. To save space, the engineers used an autodyne configuration, where a single oscillator tube worked as both transmitter and receiver. Inside a chamber only 5 inches long and 2 inches in diameter, they managed to fit 4 miniature vacuum tubes, 130 electronic components, a wet cell reserve battery, safety devices, and the explosive detonator. The oscillator generated a 70 megahertz signal, which produced harmonics at 180 to 220 megahertz. When those waves bounced back from an approaching target, they interfered with the oscillator, creating beat frequencies in the 200 to 800 hertz range. Those signals were amplified through a 2-stage system, filtered and finally sent to a thyratron gas-filled tube that set off the detonator. The power supply required an innovation of its own. Regular batteries couldn't handle the extreme G-forces or fit into such tight space. The National Carbon Company solved the problem by inventing a revolutionary reserve battery. It held liquid electrolyte in a sealed glass ampule. When the shell was fired, the shock shattered the ampule, and the shell's spin forced the electrolyte into the carbon and zinc plates, instantly activating the battery. This gave the fuse an unlimited shelf life, while providing full power only during flight. The safety systems were just as advanced. Centrifugal switches stayed open until the projectile reached the correct spin speed. A built-in arming delay of 0.5 to 0. 7 seconds prevented it from exploding too close to friendly forces. Its sensitivity increased gradually during flight, peaking at the ranges where combat usually occurred. January 5, 1943, 0800 hours, Southwest Pacific near Guadalcanal. USS Helena's radar spotted 4 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers approaching from 12,000 feet. Lieutenant Russell "Red" Cochran, commanding the aft 5-inch gun battery, had been briefed on a brand new type of ammunition only days earlier. In the magazines below, sailors loaded shells with green bands, the Navy's mark for proximity-fused rounds. "Range 8,000 yards and closing," called out the rangefinder operator. Cochran followed the incoming planes with his binoculars. Normally, his guns would need direct hits, which were almost impossible against fast-maneuvering bombers. But these shells were different. They only had to come within 70 feet of a target. "Commence firing." The first salvo roared from Helena's guns. Red tracers streaked through the sky but missed. The planes were still too far away. 15 seconds later, another salvo. At 5,000 yards and 11,000 feet altitude, one shell passed about 60 feet from the lead valve. What happened next stunned everyone watching. The shell detonated in midair, forming a deadly cloud of steel fragments. The bomber's wing ripped away, its engine burst into flames, and the aircraft tumbled downward. No longer a plane, but a wreck of burning metal. "Splash one," shouted the spotter. The surviving Japanese bombers turned to break off their attack, but Helena's gunners had the range. 3 more salvos, 12 more proximity-fused shells. Another valve was shredded when a shell exploded just 40 feet below it, fragments tearing through its fuel tanks and killing the pilot instantly. In the radio room, the report was already being encoded. Enemy aircraft engaged with special ammunition. The world had just seen the future of warfare. 2 enemy aircraft confirmed destroyed. Ammunition performance exceeded all expectations. That was the official combat report from USS Helena, but the dry language didn't capture what the crew actually felt. Gunner's Mate First Class Anthony Pui later remembered, "We couldn't believe it. For months, we had fired thousands of shells at planes and maybe got one hit if we were lucky. Now we were knocking them out of the sky with only a few shots. It felt like something beyond human skill was guiding our fire." Samuel Eliot Morrison, the Navy's official historian in the Pacific, described it more bluntly. "The smoking wreckage and burning seas proved the accuracy of the anti-aircraft guns and the efficiency of the top-secret Mark 32 shell fuse. News of this success spread through the Pacific Fleet almost instantly. But the real turning point had actually come earlier. On August 12, 1942, before Helena's debut, USS Cleveland carried out the test that convinced the Navy to put full faith in the new technology. In Chesapeake Bay, Cleveland was tasked with shooting down 3 radio-controlled drone aircraft. These drones weren't easy targets. They could maneuver, dive, and evade. The test was expected to last 2 full days. Instead, it ended in less than 2 hours. The first drone was destroyed on the second burst of proximity-fused shells. The second was hit on the 4th burst. The third never made it past the first burst. All 3 drones eliminated almost effortlessly. The Navy observers were so shocked that they canceled the rest of the schedule and immediately pushed for mass production. Admiral William Spike Blandy, standing on Cleveland's bridge, turned to his aide and said, This changes everything. Every ship in the Pacific must have these shells at once. By spring 1943, the proximity fuse was arriving in the Pacific in large numbers. The first 5,000 rounds were personally delivered to USS Enterprise, USS Saratoga, and USS Helena under the supervision of Commander William S. Parsons, the same officer who would later arm the atomic bomb aboard the Enola Gay. Security around the new ammunition was absolute. The shells were kept in guarded magazines. Only gunnery officers were told what they really were. Sailors were told they were special incendiary rounds to explain why they looked different. The results in 1943 were dramatic. Proximity fuses made up only 25% of all anti-aircraft shells fired that year, yet they were responsible for 51% of Japanese aircraft destroyed by naval gunfire. The statistics showed just how revolutionary they were. With conventional time-fused shells, it took an average of 58 rounds to bring down a plane. With proximity fuses, it took just 15. A threefold improvement, and crews were only getting better with practice. Sailors noticed the change immediately, even if they didn't fully understand why. Gunner's mate Second Class Robert Chen, serving aboard USS Essex, wrote about it in his diary. March 1943 fired 300 rounds at attacking Bettys. No hits. September 1943, new ammunition arrived with green bands. Fired 80 rounds at attacking Vals, destroyed 3. The guys think we've gotten better at shooting. They don't realize it's the shells that are doing the thinking now. Then came June 19, 1944, 1,000 hours. Philippine Sea, 200 miles west of Guam. On the flag bridge of USS Washington, Lieutenant James Van Allen, the same physicist who had developed the shockproof vacuum tubes, stood watching the radar screens. He was about to witness his invention's ultimate test. The Japanese had launched everything they had. 423 carrier aircraft, their entire air arm, in a desperate attempt to crush the American fleet supporting the Marianas invasion. Van Allen had been commissioned in November 1942 and spent the next 16 months training gunnery officers across the Pacific. He knew the math. He knew that every ship was now stocked with proximity-fused shells. But statistics and theory were one thing, combat was another. Raid 1 bearing 265. Angels 2069 aircraft, announced the Combat Information Center. Admiral Mark Mitcher gave the order. Launch all fighters. Gun crews to battle stations. American Hellcats slashed into the Japanese formations. But those that broke through faced a wall of fire unlike anything seen before. Van Allen watched from Washington's bridge as the sky filled with black bursts, each one a proximity fuse explosion. Japanese planes began falling one after another. A Zero fighter dove toward USS South Dakota, only 1,000 yards from Washington. Van Allen watched the 5-inch guns track smoothly, firing in bursts. The third shell exploded about 50 feet from the Zero. The plane didn't just catch fire, it broke apart in midair. Wings separated from the fuselage, the engine tore free and the pilot's body tumbled into the sea. Van Allen later wrote to his wife, "It was systematic slaughter. The proximity fuses turned our ships into floating fortresses." The Japanese pilots kept coming. They showed immense courage, pressing their attacks even as their squadrons were wiped out. But bravery couldn't stop technology. By the end of the day, Japan had lost 315 carrier aircraft and another 50 land-based planes. American losses were only 29 aircraft, most of them due to accidents. The one-sided defeat ended Japanese carrier aviation as an effective force. Never again would Japan launch a full-scale carrier strike. In desperation, they turned to a new and deadly tactic, the kamikaze. On USS Bunker Hill, aviation radioman Charles Calhoun recalled, "We could see them falling everywhere, in flames, in pieces, some still intact but already dead." The gunners were laughing and crying at the same time. After 2 years of taking it from Japanese air attacks, we were finally giving it back. The proximity fuses made our guns godlike, but this new dominance forced the Japanese to adapt. October 25, 1944, Aero 740 hours, Leyte Gulf, Philippines. Lieutenant Commander Robert Roberts stood aboard USS White Plains as a burning Zero deliberately crashed into USS St. Louis flight deck. The explosion set off torpedo warheads in the hangar. Within minutes, St. Louis rolled over and sank, the first major warship lost to a kamikaze attack. Japan had found the one way to bypass the proximity fuse, remove the need to survive the attack. A plane destroyed 50 feet short of its target had failed, but a kamikaze destroyed 50 feet out, could still smash into its target through sheer momentum. The divine wind had begun. Statistics revealed the brutal truth. Between October 1944 and January 1945, conventional Japanese air attacks managed only 23 hits out of 1,092 sorties, a success rate of just 2%. Kamikaze missions, however, achieved 121 hits out of 352 attempts, a staggering 34% success rate. The proximity fuse had made traditional air attacks suicidal, so Japan embraced suicide as a weapon. Even against the desperate kamikaze attacks, proximity fuses proved to be life-saving. During the Philippines campaign, anti-aircraft guns stopped or destroyed 231 out of 364 incoming kamikaze aircraft, an incredible 64% success rate. Of all the kills scored by 5-inch guns, nearly half, 44%, came from shells with proximity fuses. Without them, U.S. casualties would have been 2 to 3 times higher. Gunner's mate William Fomby, serving aboard the USS Nashville, later described what it was like. The Japanese came at us like they didn't care about living anymore because they didn't. Our proximity fuses tore them apart, but the pieces still came at us. We'd turn a whole plane into scraps, but those scraps were still moving at 300 miles an hour. The fuses stopped most of them, but the ones that made it through, God help the ships they hit. May 11, 1945, 1500 hours. Radar picket station 15 miles north of Okinawa. Commander Baron J. Melly aboard the USS Hadley stared at the radar screen with growing concern. Kikusui No. 6, a massive coordinated attack, was inbound. More than 150 Japanese aircraft were coming directly at his position. Hadley and the USS Evans were the only ships at the station, the fleet's first line of warning and defense. Multiple raids, all directions, estimated 150-plus bandits, reported the Combat Information Center. Commander Melly had prepared his crew for this exact moment. He drilled them endlessly until every sailor knew his role by heart. The ship's 5-inch magazines were packed entirely with proximity-fused shells. Gun crews had trained to keep up the punishing pace of 15 rounds per minute per gun, the absolute maximum. At 15:20, the first wave arrived, 12 planes attacking from the north. The Hadley's guns thundered to life at 12,000 yards. The new fuses immediately went to work. The first kamikaze was blown apart at 8,000 yards, the second at 6,000, the third at 4,000. The fourth aircraft, already on fire, slammed into the water just 50 yards off the starboard side, showering the ship with debris but leaving it unharmed. That was only the beginning. For the next 95 minutes, Hadley fought wave after wave of suicide aircraft. Gun barrels glowed red from the non-stop firing. Ammunition handlers collapsed from exhaustion and were carried away, replaced by fresh men. The proximity fuses kept exploding in the air, ripping attackers apart before they could close in. Gunner's mate Second Class Robert Eiley, stationed at Gun Mount 52, later recalled, "They came at us from every direction, high, low, straight in. The proximity fuses were incredible. We'd fire and 3 seconds later, boom, an explosion and flaming wreckage would fall from the sky. Fire again, another boom. It was like a rhythm, boom, 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 then 3 seconds explosion. Over and over. But at 16:15, Hadley's luck finally ran out. 3 kamikazes, all badly damaged by proximity fuse hits but still flying, smashed into the ship one after another. A fourth dropped a bomb that exploded in the after-engine room. The destruction was severe. 30 sailors killed, 68 wounded. The engineering spaces flooded, fires spreading across the decks. Yet Hadley refused to die. The gun crews stayed at their posts, even as damage control teams battled the flames and rising water. When the fighting ended at 16:55, the USS Hadley had destroyed 23 enemy aircraft, the highest number ever shot down by a single destroyer in one battle. Commander Melly's after-action report said it plainly. The proximity fuse was indispensable to our survival. Without it, we would have been wiped out in the first 20 minutes. Even when damaged and burning, these fuses allowed us to keep fighting. With regular shells, we could never have stood against those numbers. The Okinawa campaign's final tally was grim. Japan launched 1,900 kamikaze aircraft. They damaged 368 U.S. ships, sank 34, killed 4,907 sailors, and wounded 4,124 more. Post-war studies concluded that without proximity fuses, U.S. losses would have been catastrophic. Over 15,000 dead and more than 100 ships sunk. The new technology had meant the difference between victory and disaster. June 13, 1944. 0400 hours, London. A new sound echoed across the city. The harsh buzzing of the German V-1 flying bomb powered by its crude pulse jet engine. It was a sound that would soon terrorize millions. The first V-1 of the main offensive slammed into Grove Road in Bethnal Green, killing 6 civilians, including Mrs. Carrie Harrison, the first Londoner to die from Hitler's new revenge weapon. But this time, unlike the Blitz of 1940-41, London had something new on its side. On June 12th, just one day before the V-1 campaign began, and 6 days after the D-Day landings, Winston Churchill made a bold decision. Against the advice of security officials who feared the technology might fall into German hands, he authorized the use of proximity fuses to defend London. General Sir Frederick Pyle, commander of Anti-Aircraft Command, had already set up a defensive wall of 500 heavy guns south of the city. These included British 3.7-inch and American 90mm weapons, all tied into advanced SCR-584 microwave radar and M9 electronic directors, a state-of-the-art automated defense network. But without proximity fuses, even this system struggled. In the first week, the guns managed to stop only 24% of incoming V-1s. Squadron leader Prudence Hill, working in the filter room at RAF Stanmore, described what she saw. That first week was terrifying. We tracked dozens of V-1s headed for London, and almost all of them got through. The guns fired constantly, but hardly anything was hitting. Then in the second week, everything changed. American-built proximity fuses began arriving in London. Suddenly, the gunners started hitting their targets. It was dramatic, Hill said. On the plotting board, we saw V-1 after V-1 vanishing before they reached the city. The change was unbelievable. The results spoke for themselves. By the second week, gunners were destroying 46% of incoming bombs. In the third week, 67%. By the fourth week, 79%. The success was so dramatic that German intelligence reported back to Hitler that the British must have created some kind of secret anti-missile weapon. Gunner Sergeant Kenneth Brown of the U.S. 184th ALDA Gun Battalion, stationed near Biggin Hill, described the change he witnessed. With normal shells, everything had to be perfect. We had to predict exactly where the buzz bomb would be, down to the second and the degree. One mistake and we'd miss. But once we had proximity fuses, all we needed to do was fire close. The shell did the rest. It was the difference between throwing darts blindfolded and finally being able to see the board. On August 28, 1944, the defense system achieved its peak success. Early warning radar picked up 104 V-1 flying bombs aimed at London. Proximity-fused guns destroyed 96 of them. RAF fighters brought down 4 more. Only 4 managed to hit the city. From that point, the V-1 threat against London was effectively broken. The numbers tell the story. Over 80 days, Germany launched 9,300 V-1s at London. Roughly 2,340 of those were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire using proximity fuses. Without that technology, estimates suggest more than 20,000 additional civilians would have been killed, and 50,000 more injured. Winston Churchill himself would later write, "The proximity fuse, more than any other single development, saved London from devastation by flying bombs." December 15, 1944, Antwerp, Belgium. Captain William Hartman of the 407th ADA Gun Battalion reviewed his latest intelligence report with grim satisfaction. In the past 24 hours alone, his battalion had destroyed 89 of 92 V-1s aimed at Antwerp's harbor, a stunning 97% success rate that seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Antwerp was the lifeline of the Allied campaign in Europe. The port's 26 miles of docks handled 25,000 tons of supplies every single day, everything from food and ammunition to fuel and medical equipment. If Antwerp were knocked out, the Allied advance into Germany would choke. Hitler knew this. Between October 24, 1944 and March 27, 1945, Germany launched 4,900 V-1s at Antwerp, more than half the total fired at London. At first, the city's defense struggled. In early November, guns using traditional time-fused shells managed only 40% effectiveness. V-1s were landing in the port area at a rate of 30 per day, threatening to cripple the supply chain. Then in mid-December, everything changed. A Lancaster bomber made an emergency landing at Antwerp's airfield. Its cargo, 10,000 proximity fuses flown directly from Cincinnati, sent on Churchill's personal order. Technical Sergeant Joseph Crack, manning an SCR-584 radar set, saw the difference instantly. Before proximity fuses, we could track a buzz bomb perfectly, feed the guns flawless data, and still watch our shells explode just behind, just ahead, above, or below the target. After proximity fuses, nothing changed in our tracking, but suddenly every burst meant another dead buzz bomb. It was like being handed guided weapons. The German launch crews couldn't figure out what was happening. Sites in Holland that had previously sent 80% of their missiles successfully into Antwerp now saw 90% destroyed in flight. They tried everything, launching more bombs, varying times, flying them higher or lower. Nothing worked. The proximity fuses cut them down with relentless efficiency. Private First Class Raymond Miller, an ammunition handler with the 126th LA Battalion, recalled the pace of the battle. We were firing so many shells that we ran out of storage. Trucks would drive straight from the port to the gun lines. We'd unload and load directly into the guns. No counting, no records, just fire, fire, fire. In one 24-hour stretch, my crew alone fired 1 out of 400 rounds. That's 400 proximity fuses used up in a single day. Each one a marvel of engineering, gone in seconds. By February 1945, the defensive system was so effective that German V-1 launch crews began to break down mentally. Luftwaffe Colonel Max Vittel, who commanded the V-1 campaign, reported to Hitler that continuing the assault was like feeding missiles into a furnace. Hitler ordered the attacks to continue anyway. They did, but they accomplished nothing, only draining Germany's shrinking resources. The final numbers for Antwerp's defense were astonishing. Out of 2,394 V-1s engaged, 2,183 were destroyed, a 91.2% success rate. The port never shut down. Supplies kept flowing. The Allied armies kept moving forward into Germany, fueled by the supply line that the proximity fuse had protected. Then came December 16, 1944, the opening day of Germany's last major offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, and the first time proximity fuses were used in ground combat. At 0530 hours near Monschau, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group received urgent calls from forward observers. German forces were attacking in overwhelming numbers. The 38th Cavalry Squadron holding the line was outnumbered 10-1. Axelson faced a brutal choice. Sitting in his ammunition bunkers were thousands of proximity-fused shells. They had just been delivered with strict instructions. Do not use them in ground combat under any circumstances. The fear was simple. If the Germans captured even one, they could copy the technology. But without them, the cavalry would be overrun within hours. At 0600, Axelson gave the order that changed battlefield warfare forever. Load proximity fuses, set for airburst. The first salvo landed on German infantry advancing across snowy fields near Hofen. Instead of detonating on impact, where foxholes and walls could provide cover, the shells exploded at the perfect height above ground. The result was devastating. Shards rained down in a wide cone, reaching into trenches behind obstacles under vehicles. There was no shelter, no hiding place. Forward observer Lieutenant Richard Ralston, watching through his binoculars, reported, "First salvo, air burst over German infantry company in the open. Estimate 80% casualties. Survivors retreating to the woodline. Request repeat fire on woodline immediately." The second artillery salvo exploded in the trees, right where German soldiers had tried to find cover. The mix of shell fragments and shattered wood created a killing zone that stretched 100 yards deep into the forest. German veterans who had survived years of war suddenly faced something they had never seen before. Artillery that killed no matter where they hid. Feldwebel Otto Hartmann of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division lived through the barrage but was captured 2 days later. In his interrogation, he explained, "The artillery was unlike anything we faced in Russia or Normandy. We dove into foxholes, but the shells burst above us. We ran to the forest, but they exploded in the treetops. Men screamed that the Americans had a new secret weapon. Entire platoons were wiped out in seconds. Word of Colonel Axelson's success spread quickly. By December 19th, General Eisenhower formally asked for permission to use proximity fuses across the entire front. Approval came on December 21st, and within hours, every American artillery unit in the Ardennes was firing shells equipped with the new fuses. General George S. Patton, never one to hold back, wrote to the War Department on December 28th, "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. The other night, we caught a German battalion trying to cross the Sauer River. We hit them with proximity fuses. Battalion time on target. By actual count, 702 dead. The few survivors were so shaken they surrendered right away. This is a magnificent weapon, he added with foresight. When every army has this shell, we'll need a new way of fighting wars. I'm just glad we thought of it first. The weapon that was reshaping the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific had its origins in the unlikeliest places. Converted bakeries, old car garages, and even Christmas light factories across America. Turning Merle Tuve's laboratory prototype into a mass-produced weapon was one of the greatest industrial feats of the war. By late 1942, the challenge looked impossible. Each proximity fuse contained 130 precision parts that had never been built on a production line before. The tiny vacuum tubes alone required tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Every fuse had to be flawless. Just one bad part could turn it into a dud, or worse, cause it to detonate in friendly hands. The mobilization began with the Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati. Powell Crosley Jr., who had made his fortune selling radios and refrigerators, converted his entire factory to building proximity fuses. By January 1943, the plant was running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Betty Morrison, who worked there from 1943 to 1945, recalled in a 1995 interview, "We had no idea what we were making. Security was unbelievable. We were searched coming in and going out. No purses, no bags. We sat at benches for 8 hours a day, soldering tiny parts onto circuit boards. Supervisors told us they were radio parts for airplanes. Only after the war did we learn we'd been building the proximity fuses that saved so many lives." Production numbers soared at a pace that defied belief. In December 1942, output was 500 units a day. By June 1943, it was 8,000. By December 1943, 40,000 a day. And by spring 1944, American factories were turning out 70,000 proximity fuses daily. More than Germany produced in an entire month of conventional fuses. Sylvania Electric Products in Ipswich Mills, Massachusetts, became the largest producer. The facility, once farmland just 18 months earlier, now employed 10,000 workers, 80% of them women. Over the course of the war, Sylvania built 100 million miniature vacuum tubes, reaching a rate of 400,000 per day, equal to 2/3 of America's entire pre-war vacuum tube production. But there was a hidden cost discovered only decades later. Workers had been exposed to beryllium used in soldering, without knowing its dangers. In 2003, Pat Vlahos recalled his mother's story. She had worked at Sylvania for 3 years. In 1983, she was diagnosed with malignant mesothelioma. She told me she never knew what they were building. It was all secret. But the beryllium she handled every day ended up killing her 40 years later. The scale of production showed the full force of American industry. At its peak, 87 companies and 110 factories employed 80,000 workers to make the world's first smart weapon. From university labs to Christmas light plants, from hearing aid companies to auto part factories, the United States reshaped its economy to meet the demand. The cost reductions were just as remarkable. The first fuses in 1942 cost $730 each, the equivalent of $11,514 in 2020. By 1945, the price had dropped to just $18 per unit, or $256 in 2020 dollars. That was a 97.5% cost reduction, all while keeping the fuses 80% reliable in combat. Secrecy around the program rivaled even the Manhattan Project. If Germany or Japan had captured and copied the design, the Allied advantage would have disappeared overnight. Captain S.R. Shoemaker of the Naval Bureau of Ordnance even invented a deliberately misleading name for the fuse, variable time, or VT, to disguise its true purpose. The Army used meaningless code letters. Workers in the factories were told they were making radio parts or aircraft electronics. Even the abbreviation VT was classified. Gun crews were told it meant variable time if they asked. At Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, the paranoia around security was extreme. Every employee underwent FBI checks. Locals in Silver Spring noticed groups of women arriving at night and leaving in the morning, sparking rumors about the facility. Guards called everyone doctor, no matter their role, to keep outsiders from identifying key scientists. There were close calls too, moments when the entire secret nearly slipped. In July 1943, a dud shell armed with a proximity fuse was fired from a destroyer and landed intact on a beach in Sicily. The moment a dud proximity fuse was fired and landed on a beach in Sicily, headquarters reacted with urgency. A special recovery team was sent by air to retrieve it before German troops could seize it. They succeeded, but the scare forced new rules. Proximity fuses were restricted from use over land, at least until the Battle of the Bulge. Then came December 1944, when the nightmare scenario almost became reality. During the German Ardennes offensive, Wehrmacht forces captured an American ammunition dump containing 20,000 proximity fuses. If German scientists had understood what they had stumbled on, the Allies' technological edge could have been wiped away. Incredibly, when German engineers examined the devices, they dismissed them as a hoax. A post-war interrogation of Dr. Hans Gertien, one of Germany's leading fuse experts, revealed their disbelief. We studied the American fuses captured in the Ardennes. We concluded they could not possibly function as claimed. No vacuum tube could survive such acceleration forces. We assumed the Americans were spreading propaganda about so-called superweapons. The truth was stunning. Germany had the fuse in their possession and still refused to believe it could work. That disbelief proved just how far American technology had pulled ahead. Both Germany and Japan tried to develop proximity fuses, but neither ever brought one to combat readiness. Germany's research was broad but scattered. The Luftwaffe pursued acoustic fuses that triggered from aircraft engine noise. Rheinmetall-Borsig worked on electrostatic field fuses. The Wehrmacht tested photoelectric fuses. The Kriegsmarine experimented with magnetic influence designs. Between 1940 and 1945, German labs explored anywhere from 30 to 50 different fuse concepts. Dr. Werner Rambowski, one of Germany's main proximity fuse researchers, later explained, "We fully understood the theory. In fact, we had even provided the British with early prototypes in the Oslo Report of 1939. But we lacked three essentials: miniaturized vacuum tubes that could survive firing acceleration, the industrial ability to mass-produce advanced electronics, and a unified command structure for research. Instead, each branch, the Luftwaffe, the Wehrmacht, the Kriegsmarine, even the SS, ran their own projects with no cooperation. That fragmentation doomed us." Japan faced an even more desperate situation. Lieutenant Commander Yuzuru Fukao of the Imperial Japanese Navy Technical Research Institute later admitted, "By 1943, we knew American anti-aircraft fire was becoming impossibly accurate. We suspected some kind of proximity fuse but had no idea how it actually worked. We did manage to create a photoelectric version by 1945 and tested it once in a dropped bomb, but we had no industry capable of mass production." Unable to compete technologically, Japan's response turned tactical: the kamikaze. It was a grim choice, sacrificing pilots as a substitute for innovation, and a clear admission that they could not match American advances. Behind the statistics were human stories that revealed the fuse's true meaning. Merle Tuve, the scientist who led the program, carried personal burdens. His father had died in the 1918 influenza pandemic when Merle was just 17. The family fell into poverty, and his mother had to take in laundry to fund his education. His lab motto, "Save time, not money," captured his belief that in war every delay meant lives lost. Colleagues often found him alone at 3 a.m., staring at casualty reports from the Pacific, quietly calculating how many soldiers might have been saved if production had been faster. James Van Allen, who helped create the shock-resistant vacuum tubes, was transformed by the war as well. After his lab work, he insisted on combat duty. Serving aboard the USS Washington during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, he personally witnessed his invention at work. He later wrote, "It was the most satisfying moment of my scientific career, seeing physics not just proven but saving lives in real time." Ordinary workers carried similar hidden legacies. Betty Thompson, who assembled components at Crossley Corporation, only learned the truth at a 1985 reunion. "For 40 years I thought I was making radio parts. Then they showed us a film about proximity fuses. I just cried. Those tiny pieces I soldered, those saved our boys from kamikaze attacks. We had no idea we were building miracles." For those who first used it in battle, the memory never left. Lieutenant Robert Cochran, who fired the first proximity-fused shells from USS Helena, reflected in a 1975 interview. "We were told it was something special. The briefing made that clear. But when I watched that Japanese plane fall apart in midair without a direct hit, I knew we had something that would change everything. It was like being there when gunpowder was first invented. Inside the Applied Physics Laboratory, Technical Sergeant Marie Collins worked on testing the fuses. She was one of the few women allowed in the facility. We fired them from air guns to make sure they armed correctly. One day a fuse went off early. It nearly killed 3 technicians. That's when we understood. These weren't just circuits. They were weapons, and they had to be perfect, because any mistake meant Americans would die. Even German officers admitted the impact years later. Headman Klaus Richa, who witnessed the first use of proximity fuses at Monschau, survived the war and later taught at the reformed German General Staff College. He told his students, the Americans had a weapon that instantly rendered centuries of defensive tactics useless. In minutes, everything we had been taught about ground combat was obsolete. That is the power of technological superiority. The statistics backed up those claims with chilling clarity. Naval warfare before the fuse in 1942 required between 500 and 2,000 rounds to bring down a single enemy aircraft. With proximity fuses between 1943 and 1945, the number dropped to just 155 rounds per kill. That was an improvement of 600 to 200%. Over the course of the Pacific War, proximity fuses destroyed about 4,000 Japanese aircraft. Without them, analysts estimate only 650 would have been shot down using conventional shells. That meant 350 additional planes destroyed and an estimated 8,000 American sailors' lives saved, along with 40 to 50 ships that would otherwise have been lost. The impact was just as dramatic in Europe. During the V-1 flying bomb campaign against London, proximity fuses accounted for the destruction of 240 V-1s. Without them, based on initial interception success rates, only 560 would have been destroyed. The difference, 1 to 780 extra flying bombs, would have killed an estimated 9,000 civilians and injured another 25,000. The proximity fuse wasn't just another weapon. It was one of the decisive factors that turned the tide of the war, saving countless lives while proving the unmatched power of American science, industry, and innovation. Antwerp's defense stands out as one of the most remarkable examples of the proximity fuse's impact. Out of 2,394 V-1 rockets engaged, 2,183 were destroyed, an incredible 91.2% success rate. Without proximity fuses, relying only on conventional shells with about a 40% effectiveness, another 1,400 V-1s would have reached the port. That many impacts could have shut Antwerp down and strangled Allied operations in Northwest Europe. Ground combat data from the Battle of the Bulge shows just how powerful the fuse had become. In just 2 weeks, 200,000 proximity-fused shells were fired. German casualties from these shells are estimated at 10,000 to 15,000. By contrast, the same number of traditional artillery shells would likely have inflicted only around 2,000 casualties. The psychological effect was equally devastating. Entire German units chose surrender rather than face more airburst bombardments. Production numbers highlight America's unmatched industrial strength. A total of 22,073,481 proximity fuses were manufactured, involving 87 companies, 110 factories, and a workforce that peaked at 80,000 people. The program cost $1 billion at the time, equal to about $15 billion today. When you break it down by cost per kill, the results are revealing. By 1945, the average cost of a proximity fuse round was $18. Conventional ammunition required about 500 rounds at $2 each to destroy a single aircraft, $1,000 per kill. Proximity fuses needed 155 rounds at 18 each, totaling 2,790. While the fuse was more expensive per kill, it used 69% fewer rounds, reducing wear on gun barrels, cutting crew fatigue, lowering supply demands, and most importantly, delivering far more reliable defense. Leaders at every level understood its importance. Vannevar Bush, head of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, gave perhaps the most complete evaluation. The proximity fuse created a 7-fold increase in the effectiveness of 5-inch anti-aircraft guns in the Pacific, became a key part of radar-controlled defenses against V-1 rockets over London, and completely changed land warfare starting at the Battle of the Bulge. Only radar and the atomic bomb had comparable impact. General Dwight Eisenhower's assessment carried enormous weight. He said, If the Germans had perfected and deployed these weapons just 6 months earlier, our invasion of Europe would have been exceedingly difficult, perhaps even impossible. The proximity fuse gave us the decisive advantage at the critical moment. In 1945, Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal told Congress, "The proximity fuse has blazed the trail to Japan. Without the protection this device gave our fleet, our advance would not have been so rapid, and the cost in men and ships would have been immeasurably higher." Admiral Willis Augustus Lee, commander of Pacific battleships, was blunt in his judgment. The proximity fuse made the kamikaze survivable. Without it, we would have lost half the fleet at Okinawa. General George S. Patton offered both a tactical and strategic view. The proximity fuse won the Battle of the Bulge. But more than that, it showed us the future of warfare. Weapons that think for themselves. Thank God we got it first. Winston Churchill, writing in his memoirs, gave a statesman's perspective. The proximity fuse saved London from the flying bomb. It was a defensive weapon more valuable than any offensive device except the atomic bomb itself. The American genius for mass production gave us a shield when we most needed it. Even Germany's top commanders admitted its impact after the war. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stated, "The American proximity fuse made our defensive positions untenable. Entrenchments and fortifications could no longer be trusted. It was a revolution in artillery we could neither match nor counter." But the program carried hidden costs. The beryllium used in manufacturing turned out to be highly toxic. Workers at factories like Sylvania and Crossley handled beryllium-copper alloys daily without knowing the danger. Decades later, many developed chronic beryllium disease with symptoms appearing 20 to 60 years after exposure. Margaret Chen, whose mother worked at Sylvania's Ipswich mills, testified before Congress in 2001. "My mother soldered proximity fuse parts for 3 years. She was proud of her war work. In 1978, she developed beryllium disease. She died in 1983, drowning in her own lungs. She was a casualty of war just 40 years later." The Department of Energy's Worker Medical Screening Program in the 1990s uncovered hundreds of World War II electronics workers suffering from beryllium-related diseases. Many had already died, never knowing their wartime service had poisoned them. Dr. Robert Meyer, who researched the illness, concluded, "These women, and most of them were women, were soldiers of the war effort. They handled hazardous materials without protection because no one knew the risks. They saved thousands of lives, but the cost was their own health paid decades later." The fuse not only won battles, it rewrote the rules of warfare. For centuries, artillery relied on ground bursts. Soldiers dug trenches or bunkers for protection. But with the proximity fuse, shells exploded in the air, raining fragments downward into trenches and foxholes. Entrenchments became death traps. Major General James Gavin of the 82nd Airborne explained in his post-war report, "The proximity fuse made traditional infantry tactics obsolete. We had to retrain our soldiers completely. Dispersion was essential, overhead cover mandatory, and constant movement replaced static defense as the key to survival." Naval warfare changed just as dramatically. Before proximity fuses, fleets required massive fighter cover for protection against air attack. Afterward, surface ships could rely on their own anti-aircraft guns. This allowed the Pacific Island hopping campaign to speed up dramatically. Admiral Raymond Spruance put it simply, "The proximity fuse gave us tactical freedom we never had before. We could send destroyers on independent missions, knowing they could defend themselves. This multiplied our strength by allowing dispersed operations. Air defense doctrine itself evolved. Before, the goal was to fill the sky with shells and hope for a hit. With proximity fuses, the focus shifted to precise, controlled fire with a high probability of success. The proximity fuse was more than a weapon. It was a revolution in warfare, reshaping strategy, saving lives, and ensuring Allied victory. Gun crews who once relied on sheer volume of fire soon found themselves transformed into sharpshooters. The proximity fuse marked the very first large-scale success of Anglo-American technology sharing, setting a pattern of cooperation that would carry through the entire war and continue into the Cold War. The British had come up with the idea and carried out the early research, but it was the Americans who brought unmatched production power and resources. Together, the partnership became unbeatable. Neither Britain nor the United States could have developed and fielded the fuse fast enough on their own, to change the war's outcome. Sir Henry Tizard later summed it up perfectly. "We gave the Americans our ideas. They gave us back millions of weapons. It was the best trade Britain ever made." This success established a model of cooperation that lasted long after the war. The Proximity Fuse program became a foundation for NATO's future approach to technology sharing, intelligence exchange, and joint weapons development that defined the Western alliance throughout the Cold War. But the impact of the fuse went far beyond World War II. The methods and technologies it introduced shaped both military and civilian industries for decades. The miniaturization skills used in fuse design directly influenced the invention of the transistor and later integrated circuits. James Van Allen applied the shock protection techniques from fuse development to the instruments aboard Explorer 1, the satellite that revealed the Van Allen radiation belts. The organizational model was equally important. University laboratories working hand in hand with private industry under government oversight. Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, created specifically for proximity fuse research, still stands as one of the most respected defense research centers in the U.S., contributing to innovations ranging from submarine-launched ballistic missiles to space programs. The strict quality control demanded by fuse production also set new standards. Every fuse had to work at least 80% of the time under the most extreme conditions. Western Electric's use of statistical process control during fuse manufacturing became a blueprint adopted throughout American industry. The fuse itself was the ancestor of today's smart weapons. Modern radar-guided missiles, laser-guided bombs, and GPS-enabled munitions all trace their lineage back to that first thinking shell, one that could decide the right moment to explode. It all started with Merle Tuvey's ruggedized vacuum tubes. In May 1945, U.S. technical intelligence teams swept through captured German research centers and uncovered something startling. Deep underground and in abandoned labs, they found evidence that Germany had been pursuing proximity fuses too, and at nearly every major research institution. Colonel Howard Dix, who led Technical Intelligence Team 314, reported from the Luftwaffe's research site at Falkenhagen that the Germans fully understood the principles. They had even drawn up designs that might have worked. What they lacked was the American ability to take fragile lab models and mass-produce them at scale. At Peenemünde, home of the V2 program, German scientists had tested acoustic versions. At Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's testing hub, photoelectric designs were under evaluation. The Naval Center at Kiel was working on magnetic influence fuses for shells. During interrogation, Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, admitted, "We learned about proximity fuses from captured American shells in December 1944. At first our scientists said it was impossible, that electronics could not survive the stress of firing. By the time we accepted they were real, it was already too late. We had no rugged vacuum tubes, no factories, and above all, no time." This revealed the fuse's true significance. Not just clever engineering, but the unique marriage of science and mass production that only America in the 1940s could achieve. Japanese efforts were even less successful. After the war, interrogations showed that their commanders were completely baffled by American anti-aircraft accuracy. Admiral Soemu Toyota, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, recalled, "By 1944, American anti-aircraft fire seemed supernatural. Pilots reported shells that exploded at the perfect instant, as if they were chasing the aircraft. We assumed it was some kind of new radar control. We never guessed the radar was inside the shell itself." Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor strike, survived several attacks under proximity-fused fire. He later described watching veteran pilots vanish in midair, torn apart by shells that didn't even hit their planes directly. Some Japanese pilots became convinced that the Americans had built a death ray. Unable to counter the technology, Japan resorted to kamikaze missions, turning men into human-guided weapons in desperation. While Germany and Japan failed, the Soviet Union gained the technology through espionage. Julius Rosenberg, an employee at Emerson Radio and Phonograph Corporation, stole an entire proximity fuse in 1944 and passed it to Soviet intelligence. The theft was unknown until his arrest in 1950, but by then the Soviets had already fielded copies. During the Korean War, U.S. pilots faced communist anti-aircraft shells equipped with proximity fuses based entirely on stolen American designs. David Greenglass, Rosenberg's brother-in-law, later testified, Julius was proud of stealing the fuse. He said it was more important than the atomic bomb information, because it could be used right away. And in many ways he was right. Historians consistently place the proximity fuse among the three most decisive technologies of the war, alongside radar and the atomic bomb. But unlike the atomic bomb, which was used only twice, proximity fuses were in action constantly from January 1943 until August 1945. They influenced thousands of battles, on land, sea, and in the air. Dr. Arnold Kramer, a military historian at Texas A&M University, summed it up. The proximity fuse killed more enemy soldiers, saved more Allied lives, and shaped more battles than any other secret weapon of the war. It was the most effective secret weapon because it was used everywhere, all the time, with devastating results. The numbers bear him out. Roughly 25,000 enemy aircraft were destroyed or damaged. Over 5,000 V-1 flying bombs were intercepted. Tens of thousands of enemy troops were killed by artillery using the fuse, and the lives saved among Allied soldiers and civilians reached into the hundreds of thousands. But perhaps its greatest legacy was not in the statistics, but in the transformation it brought. The proximity fuse didn't just win battles, it changed warfare itself. It was the dawn of the smart weapon age and a clear demonstration that technology, when combined with industry, could deliver decisive military superiority. The proximity fuse proved something extraordinary, that democratic nations, when they mobilized civilian science and industry, could out-innovate totalitarian powers. And behind this breakthrough were countless human stories of determination, sacrifice, and genius. Merrill Tuve, the brilliant physicist who led much of the work, never fully recovered from the strain of war. In 1946, colleagues found him alone in his empty Johns Hopkins laboratory, quietly weeping. He told them, "All those boys who died while we were still developing the fuse, if we had been faster even by weeks, how many would have lived?" After the war, he left weapons research behind, dedicating the rest of his life to astronomy. James Van Allen, on the other hand, carried his wartime experience forward into the space age. The shock protection methods he perfected for proximity fuses later shielded delicate instruments aboard America's first satellite, Explorer 1, which discovered the Van Allen radiation belts. When asked about his wartime work, he would often answer simply, "I helped save lives. Everything else I've done pales in comparison." The women who assembled the fuses also played a silent but crucial role. Betty Morrison at Crosley, Marie Collins at Johns Hopkins, and thousands of others, most of their names now lost, worked tirelessly with steady hands and sharp eyes. Many never knew what they were building until decades later, but their precision saved lives on distant battlefields they would never see. Sailors and soldiers recognized the weapon's value instantly. Gunner's mate Anthony Pui of USS Helena described it best. "Those green-banded shells were like having God on our side. Every time we loaded one, we knew some American pilot or sailor would live because of it." The program was not cheap. It cost roughly $1 billion in the 1940s, about $15 billion in today's money. It required 87 companies, 110 factories, and 80,000 workers. Resources that could have gone into thousands of tanks or hundreds of ships were instead poured into making this single invention. Was it worth it? The answer is written in the battles never lost, the ships never sunk, the cities never destroyed, and the lives spared. Every Japanese aircraft brought down before striking its target saved American sailors. Every V-1 intercepted before reaching London saved British families. Every German soldier killed by an airburst shell was one less threat to Allied troops. Admiral Chester Nimitz gave perhaps the clearest judgment. The proximity fuse was worth 10 divisions of infantry, 100 squadrons of aircraft, an entire fleet of ships. It was force multiplication through technology, the American way of war. Yet history often forgets the quiet heroes. Generals and admirals are remembered, but scientists and factory workers rarely are. Merrill Tuve died in 1982. His name unknown to most Americans despite his decisive role. James Van Allen became famous for space science, but his wartime contribution faded from public memory. Men like Lloyd Berkner, Richard Roberts, and Henry Porter appear only in technical histories, and the women who built the fuses remain almost entirely unrecognized. No statues or medals honor them, though their patient work saved more lives than many decorated heroes. Perhaps that anonymity is fitting. The proximity fuse was not the product of one genius or a single commander. It was the result of shared effort. British scientists offering their research, American engineers solving impossible problems, factory workers assembling delicate parts, and frontline troops firing the finished shells. Victory came from the collective. Just 2 weeks after the fuse's first devastating use at Monschau, as 1944 turned into 1945, German officer Hans Klaus Richter wrote his final diary entry. The Battle of the Bulge was collapsing. American artillery with proximity fuses pounded his forces relentlessly. He wrote, "We face not just American soldiers, but American science. Their shells think, they calculate, they decide when to kill. We are fighting the future itself, and the future is winning. God help Germany, for we have awakened a giant whose weapons are guided by intelligence itself." Richter was right. The fuse was more than just a technical advance. It was proof that free societies could harness science faster and better than their enemies. German scientists worked in silos, and Japanese researchers never understood what they were up against. But the Allies thrived on cooperation. American, British, and Canadian teams shared knowledge and solved problems together. That trust between allies, between universities and governments, between civilian labs and the military, made the decisive difference. From a desperate British idea in October 1939 to mass production by 1943, the proximity fuse passed through every stage of Allied cooperation and industrial power. It saved hundreds of thousands of lives, shortened the war by months if not years, and opened the age of intelligent weapons that continues today. The fuse proved that wars could be decided not only by courage and sacrifice, but also by superior technology and industrial might. It showed that thinking weapons could multiply force beyond anything previously imagined. And most importantly, it demonstrated that when free nations pool their knowledge and resources, they can achieve what dictatorships cannot, miracles of science and industry that protect freedom itself. In those rugged vacuum tubes, James Van Allen taught to survive incredible stress. In the circuits designed by Lloyd Berkner to sense danger, in the assemblies built with perfect care by thousands of unnamed women, lay the razor's edge between victory and defeat, freedom and tyranny, the world we inherited and a world too grim to imagine. The proximity fuse was the most effective secret weapon of World War II, not because it was the most destructive, but because it was everywhere, used constantly and decisively. It was a weapon that could think, and in thinking it helped free people preserve their own freedom to think. The German soldiers at Elsenborn Ridge, hiding in bunkers that no longer offered protection, encountered more than superior firepower. They faced the dawn of a new era, an era where intelligence inside weapons would expand human strength beyond anything seen before. That future was born in the desperate days of 1940, proven in the crucible of World War, and unleashed across the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, all from one question: what if a shell could think? The answer to that question saved the free world.